Hi folks, welcome back. Tonight's story is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And we're talking about the importance of details. Now, one of the things they told us in grad school, I went to school for creative writing, is show it, don't tell it. Right? And details do that for us. You don't say, it's raining. You say, you talk about the sound of the rain, the sound of the water in the gutters or in the hitting the ground outside or battering against the window. Right? And Tim O'Brien does a fantastic job here. In fact, this is one of the most unique stories I've ever read and studied because of its details. The story is in the details, and the details are what each man carries, and that the story is built around it. The details actually build the characters. For example, he says, First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross carried letters from a girl named Martha, a junior at Mount Sebastian College in New Jersey. They were not love letters, but Lieutenant Cross was hoping, so he kept them folded in plastic at the bottom of his rucksack. Right? And just that little detail there, the fact that he folds them up in plastic and puts them underneath, puts them in the bottom of his rucksack for safety, tells you about how much she means to him, right? And how important these letters are. He says she often quoted lines of poetry and never mentioned the war, except to say, Jimmy, take care of yourself. The letters weighed 10 ounces. They were signed Love Martha, but Lieutenant Cross understood that love was only a way of signing. Did not mean that he didn't mean what he sometimes pretended it meant. Right? Now, think about this. He talks about the weight of everything. Later on, he'll talk about they carried jungle boots, 2.1 pounds. They carried a nylon-covered flak jacket, which weighed 6.7 pounds, which on a hot day seemed much heavier. He talked about, sea rations, the radio that they carried, that the RTO, the radio telephone operator carried. Each one of these things, and it seems like a simple, innocuous detail, but it's packed with meaning. It pulls out. You can pull out of it a lot of quality, a lot of information about the story here. He goes, the things they carried were largely determined by necessity. Among the necessities or gear, there were P-38 can openers, pocket knives, heat tabs, wristwatches, dog tags, mosquito repellent, chewing gum, candy, cigarettes, salt tablets, packets of Kool-Aid, lighters, matches, sewing kits, military payment certificates, sea rations, and 2 or 3 canteens of water. Together, these items weighed between 15 and 20 pounds, depending on a man's habits and his rate of metabolism. Henry Diamonds, who was a big man, carried extra rations. He was especially fond of canned peaches and heavy syrup over pound cake. Dave Jensen, who practiced field hygiene, carried a toothbrush, dental floss, and several hotel-sized bars of soap that he'd stolen on R&R in Sydney, Australia. Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside a village of Tonkay on mid-April. By necessity, and because of his SOP, that's standard operating procedure, they all carried steel helmets that weighed 5 pounds, including a liner and a camouflage cover. They carried the standard fatigue jackets and trousers. Very few carried underwear. On their feet, they carried jungle boots, 2.1 pounds. David Jensen carried 3 pairs of socks and a can of Dr. Scholl's foot powder as a precaution against trench foot. Until he was shot, Ted Lavender carried 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope, which was a necessity. Mitchell Sanders, the RTO, that's radio telephone operator, carried condoms. Norman Bowker carried a diary. Rhett Kiley carried comic books. Kiowa, a devout Baptist, carried an illustrated New Testament that had been presented to him by his father, who taught Sunday school in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. As a hedge against bad times, however, Kiowa also carried his grandmother's distrust of the white man and his grandfather's old hunting hatchet. Necessity dictated. Because the land was mined and booby-trapped, it was SOP for each man to carry a steel-centered nylon-covered flak jacket, which weighed 6.7 pounds, but on hot days seemed much heavier. Because you could die so quickly, each man carried at least one large compressed bandage, usually in the helmet band for easy access. Because the nights were cold and because the monsoons were wet, each carried a green plastic poncho that could be used as a raincoat or a ground cover, or a sheet or a makeshift tent. With its quilted liner, the poncho weighed almost 2 pounds, but it was worth every ounce. In April, for instance, when Ted Lavender was shot, they used his poncho to wrap him up, and they carry him across the paddy, then lift him into the chopper that took him away. Okay. Now here's what happens. Notice how they go through. He goes through the standard military gear, that you carry as SOP, but then they go through the other things, the personal items, comic books, Dr. Scholl's, soap, New Testament, and Kyle carrying his grandfather's hunting hatchet, right? So what happens here is we're getting a picture of each man. We're getting not only why they carried, what they carried, but who they are as people. Now, there's a lot of information, a lot of attention paid to how much everything weighed, and there's very good reason for that. It's because these guys are walking everywhere. They're humping, as they'll say later on. He says, when you carry something, you're humping like kind of like a camel. You're humping it across the jungle here. Years back, I did a little bit of hiking on the AT, not a whole lot, but the hardcore Appalachian Trail hikers, the through hikers, they would get everything down in their pack to as small a weight as possible. There was one guy's trail name was Tagless because he cut all the tags out of his t-shirts, out of his clothes, to reduce the amount of weight he carried. Yeah. If you were a hiker on the trail and you carry a book with you to read, you carry like a paperback. And as you finish pages, you tear them out and you use them for kindling, or you toss them along the trail. You leave them there. Well, you don't toss them out, but you get rid of them as time goes by to reduce the weights you're carrying, because after a while it gets heavier and heavier. When you're having to carry your whole living on your back, it gets really tough. So, and then we get to the detail about Jimmy Cross. And the story really is very much Jimmy Cross's story in a way, because he's carrying these photos of Martha and these letters of Martha. He said everybody carried photos, but Jimmy Cross carried a couple of Martha. First were Kodachrome snapshots and signed love. And again, he says, though he knew better. Right? She stood against a brick wall, and her eyes gray and her neutral, and her lips slightly open as she stared on at the camera. At night, sometimes Lieutenant Cross wondered who had taken the picture, because he knew she had boyfriends and because he loved her so much. Right? And then on the next page, it talks about Lieutenant Cross remembered touching her left knee. They'd gone on a date to, of course, you remember, to see Bonnie and Clyde. And he touched her knee in the dark in the theater. And she gave him this look that was filled with sadness and kind of like, oh, Jimmy, no, it's not like that. And he said, he remembered kissing her good night at the dorm door. Right then he thought he should have done something brave. He should have carried her up the stairs to her room and tied her to the bed and touched that knee all night long. He should have risked it. Okay. And what does this tell us about Jimmy Cross? Well, his intentions are of a decidedly sexual nature, but they're so innocent in a way. He doesn't want to ravish her. He just wants to touch her knee all night long. And what this tells us is that Jimmy Cross is very young, very naive, just a boy here in this theater of the world where you can die in a heartbeat, right? And he's tasked with protecting his men and leading his men, and his mind still harkens back to New York, where this young lady is. Yeah. And then immediately O'Brien takes us back to the details there. He goes, what they carried was partly a function of rank, partly of field specialty. As first lieutenant platoon leader, Jimmy Cross carried a compass, maps, code books, binoculars, and a .45 caliber pistol that weighed 2.9 pounds, fully loaded. He carried a strobe light and the responsibility for the lives of his men. So we go from the tangible, the physical, to the emotional. As an RTO, Mitchell Sanders carried the PRC-25 radio, a killer 26 pounds with its battery. As a medic, Rad Kiley carried a canvas satchel filled with morphine and plasma and malaria tablets and surgical tape and comic books and all the things that a medic must carry, including M&Ms. Now, that's not the candy. Here a footnote tells us he thinks it's the candy. The footnote tells us he thinks it's candy. Apparently the candy was used as a placebo because they would have no other medicinal value. Actually, M&Ms is slang for medicine and morphine, that kind of thing. Things that would either ease a soldier's transition, give him some, ease a soldier's pain, give him some comfort, or even allow him to die comfortably by easing his pain as he passes away. As a big man, and therefore the machine gunner, Henry Dobbins carried an M60, which weighed 23 pounds unloaded, which was always loaded. In addition, Dobbins carried an extra 10 and 15 pounds of ammunition draped in belts across his chest and shoulders. As PFCs or Spec 4s, most of them were common grunts and carried the standard M16 gas-operated assault rifle. The weapon weighed 7.5 pounds unloaded and 8.2 pounds with its fully 20-round magazine. With its full 20-round magazine. Depending on numerous factors such as topography and psychology, the rifleman carried anywhere from 12 to 20 magazines, usually in cloth bandoliers, adding another 8.4 pounds and a minimum of 14 pounds at maximum. And when it was available, they also carried M16 maintenance gear, rods, steel brushes, and swabs, and tubes of LSA oil, all of which weighed about a pound. Okay, let's skip ahead again. But Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried 34 pounds when he was shot and killed outside the Tonquet. And he went down under the exceptional burden of more than 20 pounds of ammunition, plus flak jacket and helmet and rations and water and toilet paper and tranquilizers and all the rest, plus the unweighed fear. He was dead weight. There was no twitching or flopping. Kiowa, who saw it happen, said it was like watching a rock fall or a big sandbag or something. Just boom, then down. Not like in the movies where the dead guy rolls around, does fancy spins, and goes ass over tea kettle. Not like that, Kiowa said. Poor bastard just flat fuck fell. Boom. Down. Nothing else. Okay. So what does this tell us? What can we unpack from this passage about Ted Lavender, other than the profanity, of course? And that in and of itself there's something going on there too. It tells us, the details explain to us that Ted Lavender was incredibly afraid. He was carrying all this stuff as a stopgap against his mortality and his impending death. And it didn't do him any good, right? He'd gone off to use the bathroom in the bush when the guys were, as we'll find out later, one of the guys was doing tunnel rat duty, where essentially, now the Viet Cong would build these incredibly intricate tunnel networks underneath the jungle floor. And so some guy would have to go down there and clean them out, right? You'd have to take your flashlight and your 45 and crawl down into the hole. Oftentimes booby-trapped. A lot of tunnel rats didn't make it back, and so you'd have to wind your way through there and make sure it was empty and clear, and protect you and your squad from ambush. And so, Lavender has just stepped away to relieve himself. He comes back and he gets shot in the head, and there's nothing dramatic or cinematic about it. He's just gone. And this is what astounds Kiowa and the others. And this tells us about, this detail just tells us about the unfairness of it all and the lack of poetry to it. People tend to rhapsodize about war. They talk about, the glory of war, and we read see these movies, or we did anyway. They had these accounts of the gloriousness of it and the heroism. And it's not here, right? He doesn't die heroically. He doesn't die dramatically or tragically, he just dies. And what's with all the cursing? Well, yeah, in a later story says, you send boys off to war, they're going to come back cussing. Yeah. Yeah. And so the detail there, the language that he uses also factors in the detail, the profanity. This is how fighting men often talk, because, if you're walking and suddenly a landmine explodes 3 feet in front of you or behind you, you're not going to say gee whiz. Sorry. Yeah. All right. He says, they carried all that they could bear, including the silent awe for the terrible power of the things they carried. Right? All these weapons that are meant to wreak mass destruction. He says, what they carried varied by mission. When a mission took them to the mountains, they carried mosquito nets and machetes and canvas tarps and extra bug juice. On an ambush or other night missions, they carried peculiar odds and ends. Kiowa took along his New Testament and a pair of moccasins for silence. Dave Jensen carried night-sight vitamins in keratin, high in keratin. Lee Strunk carried a slingshot. Ammo, he claimed, would never be a problem. Rat Kiley carried brandy and M&Ms until he was shot, and Ted Lavender carried a Starlight scope which weighed 6.3 pounds with its aluminum carrying case. Henry Dobbins carried his girlfriend's pantyhose wrapped around his neck as a comforter. They all carried ghosts. When dark came, they would move single file across the meadow in paddies and ambush coordinates where they would quietly set up claymores and lie down and spend the night waiting. Okay. And notice the details here, of course. One carried a slingshot. Right? The other carried his girlfriend's panties tied around a scarf. Right? And what this is telling us is these guys are just kids. These are boys sent off to war to quickly become men before their time. Excuse me. So now we come to the scene right before Ted Lavender dies. And he said, after 5 minutes, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross moved to the tunnel and leaned down, examined the darkness. Trouble, he thought. A cave-in, maybe. And then suddenly, without willing, he was thinking about Martha. The stresses and the fractures and the quick collapse and the two of them buried under the weight and dense, crushing love. Kneeling and watching the whole, he tried to concentrate on Lee Strunk and the war and all the dangers about his love, too much for him. He felt paralyzed. He wanted to sleep inside her lungs and breathe in her blood and be smothered. He wanted her to be a virgin and not a virgin all at the same time. He wanted to know about her intimate secrets. Why poetry? Why so sad? Why that grayness in her eyes? Why so alone? Not lonely, just alone. Riding her bike across campus or sitting off by herself in the cafeteria, even dancing. She danced alone, and it was the aloneness that filled him with love. What this tells us about Martha is she's unattainable. She doesn't love him the way he loves her. May never love anyone, actually. And yet he carries this kind of hope with him. He is a distraction to something to protect him from all the hideousness and the violence of war. And he goes, and a few moments later, Lee Strunk crawled out of the tunnel and he came up grinning, filthy but alive. Lieutenant Cross nodded and closed his eyes while the others clapped and Strunk on the back and made jokes about rising from the dead. Worms, Rat Kiley said. Right out of the grave. Fucking zombie. And the men laughed, and they all felt great relief. Spook City, said Mitchell Sanders. Lee Strunk made a funny ghost sound, kind of moaning, and yet happy. And right then, when Strunk made that high, happy moaning sound, when he went, ah-ooh, right then Ted Lavender was shot in the head on his way back from peeing. He lay with his mouth open. His teeth were broken. There was a swollen black bruise under his left eye. The cheekbone was gone. Oh, shit, Rat Kiley said. The guy's dead. The guy's dead, he kept saying, which seemed profound. The guy's dead. I mean, really. All right. Even that detail there is important. Yeah. He tells us I mean, this isn't pretty, but it's realistic, and it communicates to the reader, shows them, okay, this is what war is really like. And he said the things they carried were determined to some extent by superstitions. Lieutenant Cross carried his good luck pebble. Dave Jensen carried a rabbit's foot. Norman Bowker, otherwise a very gentle person, carried a thumb that had been presented to him as a gift by Mitchell Sanders. They carried USO stationery and pencils and pens, and they carried sterno and safety pins and trip flares and signal lights, spools of wire and razor blades and chewing gum, tobacco, liberated joysticks and statuettes, and the smiling Buddha, candles, grease pencils, the stars and stripes, fingernail clippers, psyops leaflets, bush hats, bolos, and much more. Twice a week, the resupply choppers came, and they carried hot chow and green Mermite cans and large canvas bags full with iced beer and soda pop. They carried plastic water containers, each with a 2-gallon capacity. Mitchell Sanders carried a set of starched tiger fatigues for special occasions. Henry Dobbins carried a black flag insecticide. David Jensen carried empty sandbags to be filled at night. And extra protection, Lee Strunk carried tanning lotion. Some things they carried in common. All right. So, anyway, you get the idea. The details of the men and the things that they carried determine who they are. This wouldn't be the same story without these details, without each man's burden that he carried with him. And perhaps the saddest thing is when Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, after Ted Lavender dies, he kneels in his foxhole and he burns. It's raining, but he leans over this hole that he's dug, and he burns Martha's pictures because he dared to love her more than his men. And the whole experience, you see the details of what happens. It changes him. It changes Lieutenant Cross. He said, it's a very much coming of age story. It's a story about coming to grips and maybe coming to understand a few things. He burned the letters, but this is just a symbolic gesture, as he tells us, because he's memorized them. Anyway, that was the things they carried. So, details, very important to the story. And the beginning of Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native, the first chapter, is just a description of the landscape, and it's incredibly compelling. Each one of these details here, the story, the death of Ted Lavender, the burdens that these men carry, all go in to make this tale both compelling and quite unique, too. So, keep that in mind. Details are vital to a story. All right. Thanks for your time and attention. I'll see you in the next video.